Chapter 12. Taking the pool balls. One night, while still in high school, Frankie and I were driving around town, talking, when we were stopped by Larry, Martin, and Sam, three of the guys from the Boar's Nest. They asked us to get in the car and told us we're going on a mission. This normally meant that there was trouble, that they were going to make Frankie and I start. When we drove out of town, we asked where we were going. They gave us the name of the town. There was an age-old nemesis. About twice a year, there would be a problem between us for one reason or another. When we arrived in town, we were told we were going to go inside the pool hall, and while the other guys were playing a game, we were to reach over, grab the pool balls, and run out the front door. This makes a lot of sense. This is where trust issues were tested to the max. To keep us from getting beat up, they were going to stop any retaliation. I was the smallest guy in the group. No matter what, I was the most likely to get beat up. The others were all quite large and tough as street standards go. Frankie and I both told them we were not in favor of this. We were told, you might get beat up after you do this, or you'll get beat up for sure if you don't. Well, that sounds nice. That didn't go down well, but we agreed. Frankie's about 6'2" and about 220, and hard-packed muscle. One big dude a year younger than me. For a guy my size, I could hold my own, but at 5'8" and 170 pounds, I didn't project much of an image of a tough guy, and I wasn't. They pulled up front of the pool hall to dump Frankie and me out. We looked through the window and saw two guys playing pool. There was another two guys who were watching. It didn't seem like there'd be much of a problem. There was no real big size to any of the four of them, so we went in. We walked straight to the pool table, scooped up the balls we could handle, and of course, there was an outcry, and then we ran outside, untouched at this point. That's when trust issues would be measured. All three of our guys stepped out of the car and stood next to it, just waiting as we ran to them. The four guys inside rushed out and saw us all standing there. They told us they wanted their pool balls back. So, true to form, Frankie and I started throwing them at the guys standing in the door. You can only catch one ball at a time, and when there are five coming at you, you're going to eventually get hit. They got hit. After summing up the situation and realizing there's no way they could win, they picked up the balls, took one last look, and turned around and walked back into the building. With that, we all got back in the car and drove off. We laughed and made fun of the expressions on their faces. Was all this necessary? No. Did we make it a life-or-death situation with guns or knives? No. This was just a harmless display of stupid. Yes, just another way guys bonded at that time.
Tipping over the outhouses. In the late 50s and early 60s, there still existed any number of outhouses previously used as the common place for the bathroom. I have no idea why they were left intact, as the sewer systems in rural America were practically all complete in their developmental stages. The need for an outhouse was almost totally unnecessary. Most families removed the outhouse next to their home and filled the hole with lime and dirt just as soon as the public sewer was installed. Others, mainly the older generation, clung to some of the old ways and kept the outhouse just in case. Having gone through the Great Depression made them leery that these newfangled sewer systems were going to be too expensive or weren't going to be reliable in the long run. They usually left them standing in their backyard. I ran around with a small group of teenage guys who thought it would be fun to get together one night to tip over an outhouse. No real damage. It would be left on its side with an open hole full of stinky waste. Come to find out, the elders, as teenagers growing up in this town, had done outhouse tipping themselves. This was not a new sport. We often talked about it, but never followed through. This night was different. Keeping in mind, we lived in a small town in rural America. After our dates were over in the evening, we would all meet uptown to talk, drink a couple of beers, and then make our way home. We all laughed, and for some reason, 18-year-old boys, after a few beers, thought it a good idea. The plan was to park our cars uptown and walk a few blocks away to the site of the tipping so anyone driving through town wouldn't know we were together. Upon arrival at the designated location, we decided to tip the outhouse over and all run in different directions so they couldn't catch us. The outhouse had been there for eons, so a simple push did the job. A few of the guys made more noise than necessary, and just as the outhouse tipped, we saw a light come on in the house. We never planned for the owner to wake up. That was our clue to run like hell. Unfortunately, the outhouse the guys had chosen just happened to be the house of my future wife's grandfather. He'd been a county deputy before his retirement, so it was not above imagination to think he would still have a gun. He came out of his house on one side, and we all ran in many directions from the other side. This worked just fine for everybody but me. At that time, electric and telephone wires around town were hung on above-ground wooden poles. To keep them sturdy, guy wires were connected from the poles to the ground. I was running as fast as I could toward the street to get to my car a few blocks away. I never considered guy wires would be in my path. It was just then I got hit with what I thought was a baseball bat to the head. It knocked me off my feet, and I tumbled to the ground. Not wanting to make any noise, I simply laid there. I could hear the owner walking in the wet grass. He had a flashlight and was shining it back and forth to catch sight of anything that moved. I was sure he was going to catch me. He walked up to within a foot of my head. He grumbled, turned around, and walked back to the house. When I got up for the ground, something was missing. My glasses were gone. I started feeling around and found one side of my glasses. Unfortunately, what I thought was a baseball to my face was actually when I ran into the guy wire. My glasses were split in half. I felt around until I found the other side. When we all met up later back at our cars, the guys had a big laugh at my expense. The next day, when I looked in the mirror, I had a big red mark across my forehead to the bottom of my cheek. It just so happened I had an older pair of glasses I could use until I got mine fixed. The next night was Saturday night, and I had a date with the granddaughter of the outhouse owner. When I got to her house that night, her father and my future brother-in-law were talking and waiting for the girls to finish getting ready. Her father looked at me and my brother-in-law, who was innocent of the escapade, and said, "I've got a problem you guys might already know about. Come with me, as I need some muscle." We walked through his backyard and ended up at the outhouse of my date's grandfather. I thought to myself, this relationship with my new girlfriend is probably over. He merely said, "We need to set this outhouse back up to cover the hole." We all bent over to lift the outhouse, nearly pulling our guts out, and positioned it back over the hole. He said thanks and made it clear in so many words that if something like this were to ever happen again, there would be hell to pay for those who participated. He knew I had been part of it, but couldn't prove it. This was from a man who wasn't at all thrilled with me dating his daughter in the first place. We went out on our date, and I made sure I had her home way before curfew. Looking at the events of the previous night, I had ended up with a screaming headache, the chance of scar on my face, and an expensive repair bill for my glasses. I eventually married his daughter, and the incident was never spoken about again. I had to chalk it up to just another experience I'd lived through. Living in rural America in the 60s, Some laws didn't seem to always apply to the people who lived there. If your dad was a patron of the local bar, the owner was more than likely a good friend. Most dads knew that their sons were going to try the underage drink, so you either tried to let them drink in a controlled atmosphere or watch them sneak around and drive to what they thought was a secret spot, which probably was the same secret spot that most of the adults in the room had already drank and partied in their earlier years. The rite of passage came in our small town of about 450 people, most of whom had been born and raised there and had multiple generations buried in the local graveyard. I've always kidded that we only let new blood into town to keep from inbreeding, as most of us were related to each other one way or another. There would come a time when your father would go to the owner of the bar, and while you were standing there with him, he would say to the owner, "He's now old enough to drink here," which had no bearing on how old you really were at the time. It was a bonding experience between you and your father. It normally happened sometime during your 18th year. Unfortunately, I had already been established myself as a drinker since everybody knew about my DUI. So my father introduced me to Billy, who happened to be a woman. She told my father that would be just fine, but she had some rules and that I was going to follow them. You were to never bring in a date or a friend and expected to drink, especially if they were from out of town. The drinking privileges were for you and you only. With that came an etiquette that would be followed to the letter. Should a stranger enter the bar, possibly a cop, you were to walk away from your drink until Billy, the female owner of the bar, would say it was okay to return. Billy was a unique person. She was a big woman in both stature and size. She was about 5'10", weighed about 250 pounds. She was as tough as nails, knew all the gossip, and would share it with you if you were willing to listen. She put up with no bullshit inside her bar. You treated her with respect as well as anyone else who came through that door. If you were involved in a fight inside the bar, your drinking privileges were over. You'd go back to being 18 again. Billy come up as a barmaid during the 40s and 50s in a rough area around St. Louis. If someone made her angry or was instigating a fight, she would bring out one of two things. One was an axe handle she had no problem using across your back or head in a situation that called for it. The other was a sawed-off shotgun she kept hidden under the shelf in the bar. She was normally a sweet, big-hearted lady you didn't want to get mad. She was a person nobody wanted to mess with. 50 years before slot machines in a bar were a thing, Billy allowed a lot of poker, pitch, and euchre to be played in her bar, which worked out well to increase additional alcohol sales. With every hand they played, a quarter was placed in a slot cut in the lid of an old Planters peanut container. Now and then an officer from the sheriff's office would hop by. He would walk over to the bar and just sit and watch. It just so happened he was asked if he needed any peanuts. If he said yes, he was handed a container with Planters peanut label intact. He would stand up, place the container in his coat, and walk out. I've since saved quarters in a Planters container for a few years. You can put $150 worth of quarters in one of those cans. 10 cans at 10 different bars netted $1,500. That was a lot of money in those days. As a product of the 60s, it seemed like the system worked. Problems in small towns were not high. The people were more self-reliant and seemed to police themselves. Peer pressure coupled with a few beatings occasionally kept the troublemakers in line and kept the police out of the small town business and back on the streets to fight real crime.